how does an economist and a climate scientist and a journalist that writes about climate see the world differently? What are the strengths and potential blind spots of each discipline? I mean, that's just sort of just so people may be aware. I think you, Bjorn, fall into the economics camp a bit. There's climate scientists,
Right.
and there's climate scientists adjacent people, like who hang. Some of my best friends are climate scientists, kind of, which is I think where you fall in because you're a journalist. You've been writing it, so you're not completely in the trenches of doing the work. You're just step into the trenches every once in a while.
Right.
So can you speak to that, maybe, Bjorn? Like, what does the world look like to an economist? Let's try to empathize with these beings that
That unfortunately has fallen into the disreputable economics. Yeah. So I think the main point that I've been trying for a long time, and I think that's also a little bit what Andy has been talking about. For a very long time, the whole conversation was about what does the science tell us? Is global warming real? And to me, it's much more what can we actually do? What are the policies that we can take and how effective are they going to be? So the conversation we just had about electric cars is a good example of how an economist think about, look, this is not a question about whether you feel morally virtuous or whether you can sort of display how much you care about the environment. This is about how much you actually ended up affecting the world. And the honest answer is that electric cars right now in the next decade or so will have a fairly small impact, and unfortunately right now at a very high cost because we're basically subsidizing these things at $5,000 or $10,000 around the world per car. That's just it's not really sustainable, but it's certainly not a very great way to cut carbon emissions. So I would be the kind of guy, and economists would be the types of people who would say, is there a smarter way where you, for less money, can, for instance, cut more CO2? And the obvious answer is yes. That's what we've seen, for instance, with fracking. The fact that the U.S. went from a lot of coal to a lot of gas because gas became incredibly cheap, because gas emits about half as much as coal does when you use it for power. That basically cut more carbon emissions than pretty much any other single thing. And we should get the rest of the world, in some sense, to frack because it's really cheap. There are some problems, and absolutely we can also have that conversation. There is no technology is problem free, but fundamentally it's an incredibly cheap way to get people to cut a lot of CO2. It's not the final solution because it's still a fossil fuel, but it's a much better fossil fuel, if you will. And it's much more realistic to do that. So that's one part of the thing. The other one is when we talked about, for instance, how do we help people in Florida who gets hit by a hurricane, or how do we help people that get damaged in flash floods, the people who are in heat waves. And the simple answers is there's a lot of very, very cheap and effective things that we could do first. So most climate people will tend to sort of say, we got to get rid of all carbon emissions. We got to change our entire the engine that sort of powers the world and has powered us for the last 200 years. And that's all good and well, but it's really, really hard to do, and it's probably not going to do very much. And even if you succeed it would only help future victims of future Hurricane Ians in Florida a tiny, tiny bit at best. So instead, let's try to focus on not getting people to build right on the waterfront where you're incredibly vulnerable and where you're very likely to get hit, where we subsidize people with federal insurance again, which is just actually losing money. So we're much more about saying it's not a science question. I just take the science for granted. Yes, there is a problem with climate change, but it's much more about saying, how can we make smart decisions?
Can I ask you about blind spots? When you reduce stuff to numbers, the costs and benefits, is there stuff you might miss about that are important to the flourishing of the human species?
So everyone will have to say, of course, there must be blind spots.
But I don't know what they are.
but yeah, I'm sure Andy would probably be better at telling me what they are. So we try to incorporate all of it, but obviously we're not successful. You can't incorporate everything, for instance, in a cost-benefit analysis. But the point is, in some way, I would worry a lot about this if we were, sort of close to perfection human race. We're doing almost everything right, but we're not quite right. Then we need to get the last digits right. But I think it's much more that, and the point that I tried to make before, that we're all focused on going to an electric car or something else rather than fracking. We're all focused on cutting carbon emissions instead of reducing vulnerability. So we're simply getting it orders of magnitude wrong. And while I'm sure I have blind spots, I think they're probably not big enough to overturn that point.
Andy, why is Bjorn and economists are all wrong about everything?
Well, the models, we could spend a whole day on models. There are economic models. There's this thing called optimization models. There were two big ones used to assess the U.S. plan, this new big IRA, Inflation Reduction Package. And they're fine. They're a starting point for understanding what's possible. But this gets to the journalism part or the public part, you have to look at the caveats. You have to look at what model. Economists expressly exclude things that are not modelable. And if you look in the fine print on the REPEAT project, the Princeton version of the assessment of the recent giant legislation, the fine print is the front page for me as a deep diving journalist, because it says we didn't include any sources of friction, meaning resistance to putting new transmission lines through your community, or people who don't want mining in America because we've exported all of our mining. We mine our cobalt in Congo, and trying to get a new mine in Nevada was a fraught fight that took more than 10 years for lithium. So if you're excluding those elements from your model, which on the surface makes this $370 billion package have an emissions reduction trajectory that's really pretty good. And you're not saying in your first line, by the way, these are the things we're not considering. That's the job of a journalist.
Summarize all of human history with that one word, friction.
Yeah. Well, inertia, friction implies there's a force that's already being resisted, but there's also inertia, which is a huge part of our, we have a status quo bias.